I'm Shannon Morey. I'm a science teacher at Abbott Lawrence Academy, a public school in Lawrence, Massachusetts. I'm also a Knowles Teacher Initiative Senior Fellow, and as part of my work with the Knowles Teacher Initiative, I've been working on the Patterns Approach curriculum, and I'm here to talk to you about the Patterns Approach and how it really helps students develop an understanding of mathematical patterns in physics through inquiry and project-based learning. So the Patterns Approach has kind of 8 main design principles. The first one is that learning is student-centered. Then we have science is a collaborative process. Science uses inquiry to discover and make sense of patterns. Science and engineering are interdependent. Teaching and learning should be culturally responsive. Learning is equitable and differentiated. Science learning is a language-rich experience, and assessment and feedback are integral parts of learning. And those are some very lofty design principles, and there's a lot of them. So I'm not going to be able to talk about all of those in depth, obviously, in the next 10 to 15 minutes. But I hope to touch on a couple and then allow you to see how some of the other ones are weaved through the Patterns Approach curriculum. So what I'm really going to focus on in the next few slides is the idea that science uses inquiry to discover and make sense of patterns. And while I'm going through that, I hope you also see examples of kind of design principles 1, 2, and 7. And like I said, I think a lot of this is, all really weaved well together in this Patterns Approach. So the idea of science using inquiry to discover and make sense of patterns is incredibly important. And in the Patterns Approach curriculum, student scientists observe, understand, and use patterns and trends in physical and natural systems to understand the past, make data-informed decisions in the present, and predict the future. And how do they do this? They do this through a process which is repeated over and over again throughout the entire curriculum. And the first part is that they make a guess based on observation. Then they do inquiry to determine a pattern. Finally, but they make consensus the pattern through consensus. And then finally, they do a data-informed prediction. So what does that look like? Well, when they're making a guess based on observation, these are some pictures of my lovely students, we show them a phenomenon, and we ask them to make some prediction about the behavior of the phenomenon. It's just like a wild guess. They just look at it and need to make a guess. And so it allows them to start conceptually thinking about the phenomenon and make kind of a generalized explanation of it, and it really gets their minds going. I've always been impressed by how engaged students become in these ideas when they're trying to make this guess. It really, really helps focus in on the phenomenon. And of course, their wild guesses are often wildly inaccurate, but that's part of the point. And then the next part, we do inquiry to determine a pattern. Again, some pictures of my students in this case. In the first 2 pictures, they're kind of doing the classic constant buggy experiment to learn about constant velocity. And then this last picture, we're studying acceleration. So when students are determining or doing inquiry to determine a pattern, they're either following or developing a method for gathering data of one of many variations of a research question through a jigsaw approach. And I personally have always struggled with a jigsaw approach. I always feel, sometimes students don't get everything they need from a jigsaw because they just become experts in one idea. But I think the Patterns curriculum does the jigsaw approach incredibly well in that all students get the sense or get the mathematical model, the conceptual model for the phenomenon, for the physics content, but then there's just something slightly different about the variation of the research question. And so, for example, with the constant buggy lab, one group will have a fast car and one group will have a slow car. And so both of them, understand that now there's this proportional relationship between distance and time, and we can start looking at the slope and talk about how that's the velocity. But then we're able to have a richer discussion because you have these 2 different variations, and students can look at, one another cars and like, oh, you have the slower car. So if you have the slower car, what's different about your graph, about your mathematical model? And so they get all the good stuff from the experiment, and then it allows for some even better consensus making as we look at the pattern. So after students have done all the experiments, we really dig down some whiteboarding where students are, talking and working together. to analyze experimental evidence and explain components of the mathematical pattern or trend. And I said that's really aided by, this amazing way that the jigsaw approach is utilized within the patterns curriculum. And again, it's always a process to get students to be excellent discussers and whiteboarders, but I think that's another strength of the patterns curriculum is that it really builds throughout the semester in terms of the depth of discussion and how much facilitation the students receive and how much they are facilitators. And so as they're discussing these different patterns, what we are hoping students do and what we talk about a lot is having students walk the triangle. And what does that mean? That means that students kind of get each point of this so that they have the experience, they have the phenomenon, and then they make some sort of graph of their data. From there, they get a mathematical representation. And when they can connect all three of these points, they really have understanding of this phenomenon. So what do students do after that? They've done this amazing discussion. They understand their phenomenon graphically, mathematically, and conceptually. And so now they can go back and use the mathematical patterns to make a prediction to the same question that they used for that wild guess. And they compare the wild guess to the data-informed prediction. Lo and behold, 99.99% of the time, their data-informed prediction is way better than their wild guess. And so it just reinforces this idea of how this process can help you develop a deep understanding and make really good predictions about the world around you. So that's, amazing. That's how the approach works. What does the course actually look like? As you can see here, it really is a spiral kind of starting from the bottom and going up, where the first unit is just all about developing student understanding of patterns. And then we start to talk about kinematics with texting and driving, energy and engineering, where students are looking at kind of a bungee jump model. I'm going to talk more about momentarily. Engineering a shoe, talk a lot about forces, ways and technology, electricity, power production, and climate science, and then space in the universe. I do want to talk about the patterns unit because it really is foundational to this entire course. It's something that I have found has greatly improved my students' understanding throughout the entire year. So what's involved? And so this is actually the only unit within the patterns curriculum that doesn't also have a storyline that involves an engineering design project. It really is foundational about developing student understanding of mathematical patterns. Where do we start? We start with a horizontal line, right? Students need to understand that sometimes in science, you change one variable and the other variable just doesn't change. And so we look at how the angle of release for a pendulum affects the period of a pendulum. Turns out it doesn't really, right? We keep it simple. We develop that horizontal line pattern. And then students look at a ball rolling on the floor. And again, getting at that distance versus time relationship. Then we look at marble packing. So how does the diameter of a circle affect how many marbles can pack into that circle? And then we look at paragraphs and we see how does the width and height of a paragraph relate to each other, and we develop a really good understanding of inverse patterns. Within these, with the ball on the floor, you can then also bridge to a linear pattern by having the ball start somewhere other than at the 0 meter mark. And this really lays an absolutely wonderful foundation to start having students understand mathematical patterns much deeper in the rest of your physics content. So next, like I said, the initial unit doesn't have an engineering project, but the rest of them do. And so I really want to talk about design principle number 4, science and engineering are interdependent, and what that, a small piece of how that looks in a unit. So like I said, I'm going to look at the energy and engineering unit. And so, students get some, a lot of different experiences here. Kind of our grounding question for this unit is how can we use STEM to make thrilling experiences safe? And, students start by just tracking energy and, learning about energy conservation. Then we do a system analysis of kind of their engineering design project, which I'll talk about in a second. And then we do like some modeling of gravitational potential energy and kinetic energy. And then we start investigating elastic potential energy. Finally, students start doing some computational thinking and kind of coding their own spreadsheet. And then they use that spreadsheet to create a thrilling ride for a kind of model bungee jump. So what does this look like in practice? Well, students receive a request for proposal from an amusement park. And they say they need this software app in order to have this new bungee jump adventure ride. And it really is a pretty complex problem for students to solve. So they have this bungee jump, and depending on the mass of the jumper, the height of the jump, how much string are you going to need to add in order for the bungee jumper to land within this perfect zone, right? And so they need to understand a lot about energy in order to be able to solve this problem. And in the end, what they do is they end up creating a fairly complex system of this bungee jump using their understanding of engineering and science and energy in order to be able to predict, based on random variables given the day of the jump, how much string they should be adding, and so how accurate were all of their calculations. And so kind of going off of that, I want to talk about how we can help make learning more equitable and differentiated. And of course, we never want to decrease kind of the rigor of the physics content. We want to make that content more accessible to students. So on its very basic model, students can be given this template of the of their app to determine how much string they need to add for their bungee jump. And so for students who don't struggle kind of with any organizational skills, this can be just perfect for them, and they're ready to go. But we have two other levels of that to help students who, we really want to access that physics content, but we don't want them kind of worrying about the organizational aspect of this. And so we might give students a little more hints about what you need to do. And again, they still need to understand those physics concepts: energy conservation, gravitational potential, kinetic energy, but they're given a little bit more help in order to get a hold of that. And then same thing, right? If students still need more help, we help them with some color coding in order to make that even more accessible to them. And these aren't the only ways in which the curriculum is differentiated in terms of many different assessments. I haven't even talked about how well the patterns physics curriculum uses claim evidence reasoning. And we have a lot of different supports for students, who, again, we want them to access the physics content. We want them explaining science in words, but they need more support doing that. And one thing that's amazing about this curriculum is that they have so many different differentiated supports available right there for you within the curriculum. And I also want to talk about, how you can adapt the patterns approach. It is incredibly adaptable. Bradford Hill, who's kind of the originator of this curriculum, works in Oregon, and now I think it's about half the schools in Oregon, half the students are learning introductory physics at a 9th grade level using the patterns approach. And so it's this really amazing collaboration of teachers, not just in Oregon, but from kind of now across the country, to help develop these materials, but that doesn't mean that everything, standards are different between states. And in Massachusetts, we adopted anything similar to NGSS, but it's not exactly NGSS. And there's some things that I needed to add to my curriculum, but I already have this amazing baseline of the patterns approach. And so, here I just showed you there's no kind of circuitry within the patterns approach because it's not a big focus, and it's not within the introductory physics NGSS standards. But I was just able to take a lot of the different things from the patterns approach and still use it with my students, and just adapt it to the curriculum I needed. And so what is available on the Patterns Approach website? There's a ton. You could basically run the entire course just with what's available on patternsapproach.org. But there is also a restricted site which gives you access to all sorts of answer keys and things too that are super helpful. And so with that, I want to thank you, but also tell you how to access the restricted site. So all you need to do is email Bradford Hill at patternsapproach.org through your school email, include your name and link to your school staff page. And then also make sure you include a Google-based email because everything's based on Google Drive if your school email is not Google-based. And thank you so much for watching, and I hope you found something interesting to take away for your classroom.